Welcome back to my channel, Star Booze.
In the absence of Cliff Richard, there will not be the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. Cliff is considered to be the original British rock star, but he had a worldwide impact. In 1965, a global survey named him the #1 male vocalist in the world, surpassing Elvis Presley himself. Richard was winning accolades, with millions of records sold. However, abruptly he disappeared from the spotlight. What might have happened? Some claim the industry made an effort to keep quiet him, some claim it's something more profound. UNCOOKED and crushed. We now know what it is, and we will disclose it, everything. When Cliff made his son married in 1958, it was unquestionably amazing. The song was characterized as rebellious, but what was unique about it? Most importantly, it was British, Cleftant, an attempt to gain acceptance in America, and he benefited from it because his crowd thought he was producing something new. The song became popular. 2 charts, which led to what they referred to as Cliff hysteria by the media. Though the media had discovered a new idol and retained in advertising Cliff's music. During the 1980s, radio stations weren't finished until his tunes were played. With this, Cliff continued to sell records and be successful. However, when the 1990s rolled along, everything got Cliff abruptly realized that her battling to keep his hegemony in the press, there were intentional trees to take him out of the talk about rock and roll. Many documentaries that addressed the British music history was discussed. Conveniently, the Rolling Stones and Beatles submitted his name or his supporters' name. Band. It struck Richard as odd. In 1964, when the Beatles were at their peak, Cliff remained popular, with 6 top 10 hits. Even Paul McCartney acknowledged the Beatles' departure for Hamburg was due to because Cliff had nearly dominated the market in Britain. Thus, Richard questioned why documentaries were making an effort to take him out of history. However, little was he aware that nothing had even grown worse. Media outlets and radio stations Richard's songs started to be called by Holmes. Elderly Chris Evans, who was then host of the Virgin Radio breakfast show, deemed Richard's music outdated and proclaimed that he would never play any of Richard's tunes once more. Richard was refusing to let someone approach him as if he were a doormat, thus hesitated to voice their displeasure with the way the media treated him. He said he required the media's backing to stay in the public eye due to he received airplay, which aided in his promotion and market music. But in spite of his complaints, nothing was altered. Is the media set on causing Richard to fail? 2011 saw the launch of an online radio station. Absolute Radio 60s was committed to, in addition to performing 1960s popular music, declared that they would not be performing any one of Richard's tunes. They asserted that Richard's music wasn't to DJ Pete, their DJ, asserted that Richard wasn't like the Beatles, the Doors, the Who, and the Stones. Cliff was the one who demonstrated to other rocks and rollers whose sound was nice. Their songs are British. He was helpful. British vocalists of rock and roll macro they were. And this is what he obtained. Richard argued for himself that anyone who failed to recognize his influence in British history or asserted that his music weren't cool, they're just lying, both the public and themselves. It wasn't Richard was the only one to defend himself. He obtained assistance from individuals such as the author Tony Parsons, a rock music critic. Tony claims that no real fan of mainstream music not fond of Cliff Richard. Additionally, Sting Richard was defended and referred to as one of Britain's best emotional and technical vocalists. Nevertheless, the sector didn't like Richard was receiving assistance and took action against those who were backing him up. In 2004, DJ Tony Blackburn was employed at Classic. Richard's tunes were played on Gold Digital. The breakfast show, on which he was the DJ. Everything appeared to be alright until the leader of Paul Baker Programming sent an email to reminding Blackburn that they had errored that they wouldn't participate in Richard. Blackburn was taken aback. Thus he proceeded to print the letter. He read the email aloud the following morning. Broadcast to the audience of the show, and then played 2 of Richard's songs after that. Blackburn was then placed on suspension. But, in spite of these arguments, Richard wasn't receiving much airplay, and had doubted if recording new songs was a good idea, would even be important. He pulled back frequently out of the spotlight, but hadn't to sap it entirely. That was going to love and transformation were involved. To Cliff, love was important to Richard, and whenever he could, he pursued it. However, life had different ideas for him all the time. Not all the time. Richard was typically Theon, who has different ideas for himself. Richard's initial committed partnership was with Delia Wixes, an Australian dancer. Everything between them appeared to be going well. For 18 months, the two had been dating, but Richard was under pressure from both his family and his expanding profession. In 1961, his father passed away, which significantly both of them had received quite close before to Richard's ascent. Richard desired for his dad to see his professional development. Although this was no longer feasible, sadly, this wouldn't the sole traumatic loss he will experience. Following the passing of his father, the duty of caring for his family fell on him. Richard thought, who was forced to choose between totally concentrating on his work so that he could support his family or oversee his profession, support his family and buying alongside Leia. Richard thought heckled and complete all three and sent a letter to Leia that he was unable to give up either his family or his job for her. He did what broke and what he thought was the finesse together with her. Leia felt heartbroken, yet Richard didn't string her, at least dot along. He genuinely thought Leia was going to locate an insane person regarding her. Is it possible that he did not like her enough? Following his split from Richard and Leia dated the actress Una Stubbs, but neither of them lasted long. Lengthy. Then he entered a romantic connection with Jackie Irving, a dancer. Looks as if Richard is attracted to dancers, isn't it? Richard located Jackie, incredibly lovely, and the pair of them were inseparable. For many it appeared as though Richard might finally get married, and he also believed that, even intended to pop the question to her. But in the end, after their divorce, Jackie received Adam Faith's spouse. However, Richard kept pursuing romantic relationships with women, considering that his primary emotion was love. His professional life, 1982 saw him meet former French Open tennis winner Anne Subaka, a Wimbledon semi-finalist, and they clicked. Richard flew to observe the relationship, and her play received the attention of the media when the two were subsequently captured embracing and cuddling hands at Wimbledon. Early in 1983, Richard was already considering getting married, but he changed after that year. Plans. It wasn't odd coming from Richard and how his previous was to be expected. The relationship had ended. Richard was already wed to the rock and roller's life and show business, and the rest was incidental. But he persisted in dating Sue, and in 1984, they remained together. Richard then came to a realization that he didn't love Sue, but he did love Sue enough to desire to dedicate the remaining his life to her. Sue had to be hurt. However, she and Richard were able toples when they split up, due to his perspective on relationships. Numerous people started to wonder if Richard was sexy. However, Richard keeps a lot of information about his life, aside from that one instance Heshan that he had no interest in. Thus, it was determined that Richard needed to. Richard disputed that he was Buell. People weren't buying it though. When heckled on the English church to confirm the marriages of persons, folks were convinced that he was a but Richard claims that he was only just making an effort to be less critical than he was younger. Richard sensed people were treating him unfairly in their judgment and stated that he wouldn't if he was his girlfriends. However, many didn't have faith in him. The entertainment sector artists who were blacklisted at the time were, as well as to protect their job, these performers started engaging in phony connections. Many believed Richard was carrying out the same action. However, Richard Waskering wasn't, and stated that even if people would think that he got married what they desired, Richard was actually addicted to his music and had no desire to get married and bring up a family that he couldn't completely make a commitment. But there was one woman. He had a deep affection for Olivia Newton-John in the 1970s. Two became friends, and they started working together. Richard went down. He was in love with her but did not act on it. Olivia became engaged to his Bruce Welch, a bandmate, before later getting married to someone else. For decades, heartbreak was carried by Richard, who never truly recovered. He kept working within the 1995 musical Olivia, and she played Kathy to Heathcliff Schaffel. According to Richard, she was a soulmate. None of the women he encountered died equate to Olivia. Additionally, when she passed out, Richard was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2022. Crushed, the woman he loved the most after then. Music died, and as a result he moved out of the spotlight to allow him to weep for her, but he never all suddenly vanished at this stage. You'll see what caused it soon. In a way, Richard liked music more than musicians don't. It didn't seem like a method to generate income alone, but as a means of. Richard enjoyed showing off, and so in the beginning of his career, following the amazing first single, he was dubbed the British equivalent of Elvis Presley. Richard did his share of the work and adopted the flamboyance of Elvis as he performed. He adopted a bad boy rock stance. Mindset. He avoided looking at the camera, or the audience. The game was altered by him. For rock and roll musicians from Britain, and Lennon John, who had earlier British music, was condemned for buying highly esteemed. This well-known musician is the target of the media's intense efforts to remove Richard. Did you do anything to make the media turn against him? Richard thought the media was attempting to eliminate him out of the limelight since he did the typical rock's picture. Star. In contrast to the majority of musicians, Richard declared his faith for each other and led a life devoid of women and booze. Thus, without a way of life driven by Richard, and drink was thought to be dull. People didn't connect his music to contentious issues that has stated that radio stations weren't given the inspiration to perform his music. He slammed the music business for attempting to encourage artists to seek controversy in order to records could be sold by them, even when you are aware knowing they might be placed on a blacklist. Two reporters stood up to protect Richard. One Sam Leith. One of them asserted that Richard didn't lead a normal rock life and roller, and as a result he was taught to be a phony rock and roller rather than drinking. Richard cherry-shed fruits that a lot of people thought were odd. They were unable to comprehend why Richard was the way he was, and instead of accepting, they made fun of him. The alternative Jean Robb, a journalist, explained Richard as the rebellious party that disobedience, and a man who had turned into an opposition to the dominant culture of tunes, even while the media is turning on him and the fact that he has no family of his own. Richard was never really on his own. He had companions by his side all the time. He was pals with Cilla Black, and the two spent a lot of time together over various nations. Sadly, Cilla passed away in 2015. Besides Olivia and Cilla, Richard has experienced fatalities that were important to him and hope prevented him from feeling isolated. Every death forced him to step away from the limelight to weep. In the year 1999, his close companion, the television host Jill Dando from Britain, was killed, and Richard discovered his death is difficult to accept. However, that wouldn't his defeat's conclusion. Richard could only observe in horror as the Northern Irish daughter Gloria Hunterford Cairn, a broadcaster kiting, received a breast cancer diagnosis. Cancer. For him it was a significant occasion. He made certain to attend faithfully to the best of his ability. Regretfully, Karen passed away in April 2004. Richard then sang his song Missy Nights in honor of her during her funeral. As Richard handled these setbacks, the loss of her mother was difficult for her own brain as a result of Alzheimer's. In 1997, following her diagnosis, Richard and it had been challenging for his sisters to control their mother's illness. Observing she lost sight of who she was and who they were, smashed them due to her Richa, who had previously received renown as a benefactor, started to contribute to the non-profit that studies dementia. He assisted Alzheimer's Research UK. Raise awareness as well as money of the illness. He made public remarks about the state of his mother and what it required to look after her. But even so, despite his best efforts, Richard was only able to observe when his mother eventually died in 2007. Each of these incidents amonged Richard, but none did so as much as what transpired after it. Richard appreciated Portugal and had been traveling to Thebesinas for both personal and professional use since the 1960s. He even had a residence there. Richard drank some wine. Conducting business in the nation, which many thought was strange because they thought that rock stars shouldn't possess that sort of a company. However, Richard wasn't the kind that cares about what others say. His enterprise, encompassing their investments, brought him the selection of the Order's command of the country's Prince Henry when he went on stage. Richard Adara Dunwinding in Portugal. Additionally, in August he was savoring the warmth of the country at home. When he turned on, he switched the TV's channel to the BBC to watch the news, and he was astounded by what he witnessed at him. Back in the United States, it was his home. Kingdom. The BBC was broadcasting live. Announcement of a raid on his residence based on a man's assertion that he was sexually attacked by Richards. There were claims that Cliff was hiding something. Space in the home where he assaulted individuals, but Cliff claims that there was no such room. It surprised him based on his observations. The cops were attempting to steer clear of a Jimmy Savior scenario. We were thorough with Richard. In it was disclosed in 2012 that Jimmy had been assaulting others sexually throughout his life, from children to seniors 75 years old, aged, with the majority of his victims being a woman. Despite his peculiar personality, Jimmy received recognition for his humanitarian endeavors, which enabled him to maintain connections with the British monarchs and other influential people. Jimmy utilized his influence and charity to assault victims, and the authorities were certain Richard was following suit. Richard returned to the United Kingdom and proceeded directly to Palace willingly for an interrogation. He refuted the accusations. According to him, he have observers who could offer an alibi, but the authorities didn't think him. People didn't either. Already, the media presented him as though he did belong and he was perceived as. Thus, in the perspective of the Richard was a strange individual who might be accused of anything. The police in the UK kept looking into it but failed to discover anything that would lead to take him into custody. It appeared to be what their actions or intentional, and they deserved to utterly destroy Richard's repute to the extent that he refused the possibility to publish music without having to considered to be a sexual abuser. But there were those who backed Richard. The previous public relations director Adonis, Lord MacDonald, of the police were chastised by Riverglaven QC Force for the way they handled the matter, and the BBC received a lot of criticism for its coverage of the search. As it wrote it out, the cops were the ones who disclosed the look for the BBC so they may report on it. Richard was unable to leave without drawing unfavorable attention, and because as a result, he organized a trip to the United States to watch the Tennis Open Idols for the same reason as well encouraged him to avoid going to the Cathedral of Canterbury. The event was jarring. Richard, he became lightheaded of Bellepetchingles and fell into a funk. He no longer cared about anything other than get his name cleared, but the police were a salute to prevent him from doing. Chief Constable David Crompton continued speaking with the BBC, but after seeing that nothing was on Richard, Crompton issued a public apology to Richard. However, that apologies didn't work. Richard's reputation is worth anything. Next, things worsened. A man named Richard Dan threatened to disseminate inaccurate information of him. Richard had two options. He may either fight the man or pay him off, and run the danger of hearing untrue rumors about Jim in the open. He was already unpopular and people would simply believe anything that contradicts him. Richard was conflicted but chose to battle the man and inform the police about him. However, the police doubled down in spite of that arrest, down on him. They refused to simply acknowledge that they were mistaken and that the charges against Richard was untrue. Thus, in February 2015, the police announced that the investigation energized, the alleged transgressions had escalated and would keep going. Richard declared his innocence at away and contested the claims. The police still couldn't locate a review. Author of the police's conduct demonstrated that they had violated their own procedures. Finally, on June 16, 2016, the authorities dropped Richard's charges. He was at last at liberty, but he didn't genuinely experience relief. The BBC and the policy apologized to him in public, but this was insufficient for Richard. He filed a lawsuit against them. Both cleaned his name and received a large payout from them. However, was this sufficient to repair his damaged reputation? Richard was shaken by this incident. That during it, Richard vanished from the limelight merely to recuperate. Following that, Richard did sue more. However, he has recently submitted to age as a phenomena he cannot defeat. Because of considering his age,